Okay, good evening. Good evening. In the spirit of the end of Michigan time, we're actually going to start now as opposed to 10 after. So good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture, which is part of our new series on the history of the University of Michigan, sponsored by the Bentley Historical Library. I'm Gary Krenz. I'm Director of Post-Bicentennial Planning at the Bentley. I appreciate your joining us. And I appreciate your patience with our little bit of a jerry-rigged setup tonight, but there will be slides, as you can see. So these monthly talks are part of our effort to continue the exploration of U of M history that was kind of accelerated by our 2017 bicentennial. This academic year so far, we've heard about the Detroit Observatory, about the history of food at U of M, about the origins of athletic competition. Looking ahead for a moment to next month, our lecture will mark the 150th anniversary of the admission of women to the university. We will hear from Andrea Turpin of Baylor University, and she's going to speak on coeducation for democracy, the changing moral vision for educating the sexes, 1870 to 1920. I hope you can join us. I might also note that the Bentley and others are doing more things. We'll be doing more things to mark the 150th anniversary, including some articles on the Heritage website by Kim Clark, social media, weekly, whatever you would call it, with social media, with hashtag UMichWomen150, an exhibit at the Bentley and an online exhibit on our History of U of M website, and more. So please check those things out. Now, for tonight's talk, right, which is titled Telling the Truth About the Liberal Arts, Histories and Futures. Our speaker, of course, is Terry McDonald, who is director of the Bentley Library, and a longtime citizen of this university. In fact, I've known Terry for at least 20 years. I think we first met when you were associate dean in LSA, but in any case, I am frankly relieved that finally, after all this time, he is going to tell the truth about the liberal arts. Seriously, there are few people as well positioned as Terry to discuss tonight's topic. Before becoming director of the Bentley in 2013, he served for 11 years as interim and permanent dean of LSA, an institution with more than 2,000 faculty, 17,000 undergraduates, 2,000 graduate students. Includes divisions for the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. So overall, it is larger and more expansive than most universities, and is to be sure the core of liberal arts at U of M, liberal education at U of M. In addition to his administrative work, Terry is an award-winning historian of American history and author and editor of 4 books and numerous articles. He is an outstanding researcher and teacher, and on that basis has held an Arthur F. Thurnau Professorship since 1993, and has received numerous other teaching awards. So he clearly comes at this topic from several bases of experience, and I have no doubt you will enjoy and learn from his talk tonight. Please welcome me, and please join me in welcoming Terry McDonald.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I know that coming out to a 7 o'clock in the evening lecture is a bit of a sacrifice, so I want you to know how much I appreciate you being here. We're going to have a few moments of audience participation tonight, so let's start with this one. How many of you has at least one of those worthless liberal arts degrees? We're good. Raise your hand. Don't be embarrassed. Okay. How many have more than one of those terrible, cheap, worthless liberal arts degrees? All right. How many of you think something very special happened on the way to at least one of those liberal arts degrees? Okay, good. So I wanted you to, I think we have something in common, and I wanted to start with that, and I want you to know that whatever I'm talking about tonight is beginning with that standpoint, and that basically is that there is something very special about the liberal arts experience, and yet the ways in which it's manifested itself through actual curricular organization over time have been varied. And so the truth is, nothing that we think was crucial to that experience is necessarily necessary to it going forward. It's the experience we had with the structure at the time that we actually attended college or university. And I think that perspective on the conversation about the liberal arts is somewhat missing today when to some extent there are those who are deep critics of it and there are those who are defenders of it, and it's not clear that either one of them is talking about actually what is the important kind of idea in it. So let me first make the announcement that I am not going to explain how much a liberal arts education is worth tonight. So this is, if some of you want to just leave after this point, you can. There was a wonderful article about this in the Washington Post just a couple weeks ago. Liberal arts education, waste of money or practical investment? This is the question today, right? I mean, this is everywhere. Studies conclusions might surprise you. Spoiler alert, if you went to a liberal arts college, about 40 years down the road, there will be an income differential for having a liberal arts degree, but you can get the details from that. If you went to the University of Michigan, forget it. You're not in that category at all. All right, this is the topic, liberal arts education. What is it and where did it come from? And if it was in the Washington Post, it might say lectures, conclusions might surprise you, but this is not the Washington Post. So a few comments about why being a historian is hard. I want you to feel sorry for me at the beginning of this lecture. And that's, to begin with, the past really always speaks in multiple voices. So essentially, the past is always saying things are different here, and that's why we study it. The humanizing aspect of studying the past is discovering how different things were in the past. On the other hand, it's also true that the origins of the present will be found here in a certain kind of, sometimes very straightforward and sometimes very inchoate kind of way. So we study the past also to understand something about the origins of the present. Now, the past is also always saying everything here is gone and the same thing will happen to you. There's that famous Joni Mitchell song, I've seen some hard, hard places come down to smoke and ash. That's actually a lesson of history, that everything changes and goes away. And therefore, it's true, if based on history, that nothing that exists today needs to exist. So when we go back and look at history, we're not necessarily finding the rationale or justification for the present. We're actually finding some leverage on the present. The past can help us understand the present. It doesn't determine it, and the institutions that we live in aren't necessarily all necessary. Now, it's hard being a historian because sometimes the past is disappointing. For example, at the University of Michigan, academics have always been more important than athletics. True or false? If you do a historical analysis, it's going to be a very disappointing answer, or at least one that was disappointing for me. It can also hurt your feelings this way. So here's this uncommon education for the common man. We're going to respond to this, by the way, with applause. We're going to have a test. An uncommon education for the common man. Which 19th century figure said this about the University of Michigan? How many think it was Thomas Jefferson? How many think it was President Tappan? Okay, a few people think it's Tappan. How many think it was President Angel? Okay, a few are thinking sticking their neck out. How many think the answer is D? Oh, you cynical people. In fact, the answer is no one ever said it. There was never a statement made about this in the 19th or early 20th century. It appears that this was an attribution to the 19th century that was actually invented in the 1980s with no historical basis in fact. Sadly, and I want to thank some people in this room, Brian Williams, April McKay, were involved in a search where we said, gee, this is so cool, let's find the context for this. It doesn't exist. Okay, so history is not always your friend. It can be really hard and disillusioning, and maybe some things I say tonight will feel that way. All right, let me just give you a preview. There have been really three major periods in the history of higher education curriculum, and I'm going to try to take us rather quickly through this. This is 200 years of history. It won't be deep, but it will give us a sense of the structure of these kinds of traditions. And you'll notice that something interesting here, I'm only using the word curriculum in regard to one of them, because in fact the other two systems did not prescribe a curriculum. They prescribed a kind of a structure for learning. So the classical curriculum reigned high in American higher education, including at Michigan, from about 1820 to 1880. The elective system came in the 1880s and really was quite popular until the 20s, 30s. Liberal arts structure, the one that we're used to, came in about 1930 to the present. And I want to basically take us through each of these things. Because my topic tonight is the liberal arts, I'm going to start with that and then work back again to the history of that. But here it is. So the liberal arts is a curricular structure for 4 years of undergraduate education. It's not a statement of principle in and of itself. This is the liberal arts at the University of Michigan. It's a number of credits for graduation, and it's divided into 4 big categories. You've got certain skill courses which contain, whoops, did our projector die out, or? Yeah, you got to have a technical background to keep this going. There it is. It came back. Okay. Yeah, now we can see the whole thing. That's good. All right, so you've got some skills. These are the college requirements. There's 13 of them approximately, as I recall. You've got some distribution, humanities, social sciences, natural science. You've got some electives, and you've got a major. So you have to fulfill these categories and come up with this many credits. But of course, it's all open. There's nothing specified. In that sense, it's a structure and not necessarily a curriculum. Now, this structure is uniquely American. It doesn't exist anyplace else on Earth, except recently some countries have tried to adapt this structure to their own systems. And it's popular in America because it's permissive. It doesn't specify the contents of anybody's undergraduate education. It specifies the number of credit hours and the number of ways you have to distribute those credit hours. So it's basically a kind of a structure for learning. And as we'll see, in history, there have been curricula that were much more prescriptive. Now, it's fragile. The numbers, this room is very unrepresentative of college degrees. Today, about 30% of college degrees are in any area of the liberal arts and sciences. Any area. Very small number. And this, probably the purest form of liberal arts education, is this freestanding liberal arts colleges. And in America, if you took the 51 highest ranked freestanding such colleges, the students there would not fill Michigan Stadium. There's just barely 100,000 students in freestanding liberal arts colleges at the very top of that distribution. And then finally, the three-division college that you might be familiar with, or we certainly are here at Michigan, humanities, social sciences, natural sciences at the university, is rare. So most big state schools have split up their colleges according to the divisions. So you'll have a college of humanities, a college of sciences, a college of this, whatever, some kind of combination. Michigan State, for example, are all split up. There's been a trend to sort of try to reunite them, but the fact is a place like Elliot, which throughout its entire history has had all the divisions in the same institution, is very, very rare. You won't find it very often anywhere in this country. And this is going to have an implication, obviously, for how people understand the liberal arts when they come here. All right, so here's the majors today. It's just kind of interesting. By the way, this is taken from what appears to be the winter graduation in 2018. But this is a small number, but if you multiply, the order, I think, is about the same no matter what. So you see we've got economics is the most popular major, psychology is next. We've got BCN, biopsychology, cognitive, and neuroscience. Oh, that's a subdivision of psychology, it's another psychology major. Political science, computer science, international studies, communication studies, neuroscience, another branch of psychology taught with biology. We could use a college of psychology, probably. And then we've got mathematics and English. A couple of things. There's a strain of vocationalism in here. Right? These most popular majors clearly are those that at least are plausibly representative of some kind of vocational training. There is a dearth of humanities majors in this number. English's position is remarkably low compared to 10 or 20 years ago, and my own department, history, which was in the top 10 for decades, is no longer in that list. So you can see that things are, this system, this structure, which allows choice and encourages choice, can produce a lot of different kinds of outcomes, which may or may not be the ones that people might like people to do. All right, so this is the most recent structure in America, but it's now 100 years old. Right? It's been in place for almost 100 years. So in a funny way, it's the most recent and the longest lasting, and to some extent, the less frequently challenged of all the three that I'm going to talk about tonight. And we could ask ourselves if that's important. Turns out that LS&A students got into this concentration distribution model with the people who arrived in 1931, and these were the first graduates with concentrations, and interestingly enough, the list is very similar to the one that's going on there. Economics, history, although history would go down. Now there's a couple of odd ones. We'll talk about law and medicine here, sociology, English, sciences, French, social sciences in 1933. All right, now the important thing tonight is to keep in mind that a curricular structure may not guarantee an intellectual experience. So when we talk about what we want from a college education, this is what we want, this statement. Imagine a different world, a place where students find deep meaning. Learning changes people. It makes them into better problem solvers, able to think, not afraid to make mistakes. Learning Remains an Adventure, Deep Humility, etc. Ken Bain's wonderful books, What the Best College Students Do. If any of you have children or grandchildren approaching college, it's a fabulous book for them to read. He's got other ones, What the Best College Teachers Do. Really a wonderful guy. This is what we want to have happen. And we don't really care about the specifics of the curriculum. We want an experience that transforms the person. And some of you think you had that. Now, did you have it because of the structure of the liberal arts or because of 25 or 30 other things that were going on in your life at the time, whatever? This is the question that we all really kind of have to consider. So this is it. We want to have this experience. We want to know how to create that. It may or may not be created by the current structure for the liberal arts. Maybe it could be created by something completely different. And 100 years down the road, maybe we should ask a question about that. All right, so this is the classical curriculum at its high point. It was really the first curriculum in American higher education that can be kind of called that. These dates are approximate. Some schools had it before then. Some schools had it after that. The University of Michigan was entirely devoted to it in these years, and these were the characteristics. You had to present Latin and Greek for admission. You couldn't come unless you could do Latin and Greek. The readings in the curriculum were specified, and they were in the classics. There was no choice. Everyone took the same courses together for the entire 4 year. Freshmen, sophomores, juniors, senior, all took the same class every day together for the whole 4 years. You became very connected with your class. The faculty was mostly amateurs, that is, not academically trained people. Many of them were ministers because they were oftentimes the highest educated people in the region. The teaching method, wonderful recitation and declamation. You would memorize and deliver large pieces of text 3 times a day, 5 days a week. And you would get, at the end of that, 4 years of that, you would get a bachelor's degree with no major. This was the so-called classical curriculum. Now, if you had showed up at the door of Michigan in 1851, and don't forget you had to be a man, so there were no women here until 1870, as Gary just pointed. This is what your schedule would look like. So freshman year, okay, Latin, Greek, Latin, Roman and Greek, a little bit of science. This is pretty much going you through almost kind of like high school math. Sophomore year, Horace, Xenophon, Sophocles, rhetoric, etc. Junior year, Tacitus, a little more political economy, natural philosophy, rhetoric, chemistry. Senior year, Plato, philosophy, etc. So you can see the core of this, and if you actually look at the actual kind of structure of the curriculum, here's what it looked like in terms of the years of the curriculum. So basically, you're very heavily invested in the classics almost all the way through. You slowly start to add some science courses. But importantly, the entire curriculum is focused on this. That is, all the seniors take together these classes, and it's hard to see it, but they involve psychology, intellectual philosophy, and importantly, political grammar, the history of the Constitution, political economy, all kinds of courses that are designed to prepare you to be a good person and a citizen. So this was a curriculum that was aimed to produce a certain outcome, and the outcome was a man, of course, in these days, who was going to be an active citizen in society. So on balance, and by the way, we could spend hours just talking about the details of this, but moving on. So the people that taught this curriculum believed that studying the classics in classic languages sharpened the mind just by the sheer discipline of learning the languages of Latin and Greek. But as importantly, that Americans had to study the fate of the early republics. So if you wanted to avoid the dictatorships that plagued Greece and Rome, you had to read the stories of those civilizations and see what happens to republics that go bad. So there actually was a kind of a political purpose in the curriculum. The focus was very much on the public role of producing good male citizens. The curriculum points to these required courses, by the way, which were usually taught by the president of the university. So these capstone courses in the senior year were taught by the president of the University of Michigan and other universities and colleges. Now, not so good. Zero interest in new knowledge or current events. This just wasn't part of the classical curriculum. Lockstep, unchanging, required curriculum taught with dreadful methods, recitation and declamation. Amateur faculty who could teach, who might be able to teach well, but they couldn't change the curriculum because they weren't really very intellectual, and they certainly weren't doing anything that would produce new knowledge. And there was also no connection with professional education, which, by the way, I mentioned just because that becomes important later. The professional schools, for most of the 19th century, did not require a bachelor's degree. So when you applied to the University of Michigan in 1851, you could go direct, well, after that, 1861, let's say, you could go just right out of high school or whatever school you had to the medical school or the law school or the literary college. There was no need, there was no notion of a 4-year undergraduate degree as preparatory to professional training. There wasn't any connection until very late, and in fact, most of the time, even early in the 20th century. All right, so this is the classical curriculum, the first curriculum. Michigan was entirely part of this for about 40 years and very, very dedicated to it. So this is a modern-day inheritance of the classical curriculum. And it's a principle that we all believe, but it's important to see where it kind of comes from, and that is you want to have a useless college degree. All right? So the non-vocational, non-career-based uselessness of the subject matter is what opens the door to appreciating knowing for the sake of knowing. And the whole idea of liberal arts education eliminates the distraction of vocationalism, and its lack of career-directed purposefulness separates knowing from the need to know, learning from the need to learn, and the desire to understand from the need to understand. This is a legacy of that first curricular setup, the classical curriculum, which now has become kind of a principle of the liberal arts in this very, very interesting book, by the way, Victor Farrell, Liberal Arts at the Brink. Very, very interesting analysis of the situation of the liberal arts colleges in America today. But just to say, I think most of it in this room probably believe this. I do believe it, but it's also important to understand where it comes from. It comes from this moment in higher education history for 40 years or so, when almost by definition, people were taken out of the present and put into a kind of non-practical place. Now, in a society like America and Michigan, there are going to be a lot of pressures on this curriculum, and the first one was just simply outside demand for new knowledge, which might or may not have been the best knowledge. So here we have 1868 already. Now we've got multiple degrees, the classical course, the scientific course, the Latin and scientific course, that was interesting, the course in civil engineering, the course in mining engineering, the course in mechanical engineering. So little by little, the demand for other kinds of training is coming into the curriculum. But you still had to present Latin and Greek for admission, even if you wanted to be a civil engineer, and you still had to spend the first year or two studying the classics, even if later on you were allowed to take a few courses in civil engineering. So one pressure on the classical curriculum is just the demand of society, and frankly, this was oftentimes communicated to the regents, and the regents would ask the literary college, don't forget, these are all in the literary college to begin with, they would ask the literary college to put these programs in the curriculum. All right, but two announcements killed the classical curriculum, and they were powerful because they were inside the academic system. And the first was this announcement in 1869 at Harvard that all classes would be elective as soon as possible. No requirements whatsoever at Harvard in 1869. This is the beginning of the so-called elective system. And the second thing is 1876. Johns Hopkins University opens up and offers the first American PhD programs. These two things were going to radically reshape American higher education. And they were the death knell of the classical curriculum, much more than the demand for mining engineering or anything like that, because this was going to hit the actual heart of the teaching process, which was going to be the faculty, of course. So there never was a more unlikely revolutionary than Charles Elliot, the president of Harvard University, the longest-serving president in the history of the university, who was an analytic chemist at MIT when he was brought over to be the president of Harvard in 1869. He stayed until 1909. He was absolutely committed to the idea that the classical curriculum had to be annihilated. And in fact, that there were only two criteria for a college curriculum. One, the choice of the student. When the revelation of his own peculiar taste comes to a young man, always, let him reverently give it welcome, thank God, and take courage. That if you want to take this class, you take this class. Don't worry about taking Greek and Latin because I told you to. And then more importantly, the university as a place of study is at any moment what the faculty make of it. This was a radical proposition for these days, but it turned out it was the future. That is, that the faculty would shape the curriculum from their interests, and that the curriculum would represent the meeting of the interests of the students and the faculty. So, in fact, he was very unkind to other universities, making this statement that the American university has nothing to learn from medieval universities, nor yet from those still in the medieval period. This was the poor things that were still teaching the classical curriculum. So in 1872, lockstep teaching is abolished. Students can take, after the freshman year, students can take any course they want, anytime they want. Radical change from the classical curriculum. 1884, compulsory Greek and Latin abolished, and the whole first year is elective. So he's doing this gradually. By the way, stiff opposition to this. Don't forget, everybody who was on the faculty anywhere, Harvard, Michigan, et cetera, had the classical curriculum themselves. So getting them to agree to the elective system was not automatic at all. It was important to kind of bring them along, so it took a while. And then by the 1890s at Harvard, all graduation requirements are abolished. Now, it may shock you to know that there's a kind of a Harvard tropism in American higher education. Whatever Harvard does must be okay, and Michigan, therefore, with a few years' lag, made all these same changes in the curriculum here. So here we have the 1905 Bulletin of LS&A. Requirements for graduation. The degree is conferred, 120 hours of credit. This credit must include courses 1 and 2 in rhetoric. With this restriction, the student may select from the work offered in the department such courses as he is qualified to pursue. Boom. The entire curriculum at Michigan by 1905 was elective. In fact, it was before then. A student could take any course anywhere. By the way, anywhere means any college. So we saw those kind of funny-looking degrees, law, medicine, in the first set of concentrations in LS&A in 1933. You could take any course you wanted. You could take enough courses for a major in law. You could not get a law degree, but you could take the classes in the law school. You could get a degree in medicine, an undergraduate degree in medicine in medical school. You couldn't get a medical degree, but you could take courses there. You could take courses anywhere you wanted. This actually was radical and actually kind of interesting when you think about it, that the whole university was open to the students in the elective system here. Now, part of that, quite frankly, was the status of the medical school and the law school, not exactly top-notch in those days. So there was another issue there that they were probably happy to have some. It wasn't until as late as the 1940s in Michigan, you could practice law without going to law school at all. So it's not as if people were filling the chairs in the law school. They didn't have to do it to practice law. All right, so we're entirely elective by 1905. Radical change. I mean, just to think about this, when you think about going from this very structured curriculum to this one that's just basically all choice. So it's not going to be surprising that some people are going to be concerned about this. Wow, this is kind of out of control, right? Nobody quite knows what anybody's doing. But alongside this is a completely separate set of developments that's going to be crucially important for getting toward our time period, and that's basically the professionalization of the faculty. So we've got these kind of curricular battles happening inside the colleges, but outside the colleges, all of a sudden, we have national disciplinary organizations emerging at exactly the same time. So just at the time that all the universities were thinking about changing their curriculum, the professional associations of academics are emerging. So we've got the Modern Language Association, American Historical Association, American Economic Association, et cetera. The first university press at University of Chicago, 1892. Faculty are now going to be able to go to Johns Hopkins and elsewhere and get the PhD. They're going to be taught how to do research. They're going to see that there's national incentives to reward research. You're a member of these associations. They make a big thing out of those that are coming to the national meeting. And teaching is going to become increasingly based on faculty research, which means it becomes more and more specialized. But this is perfect for the elective system. So there's an interesting meeting of two completely different tendencies. On the one hand, the professionalization of faculty in this way. On the other hand, the elective curriculum, which basically says, and Elliot said that, faculty should teach their research. And that was the kind of theme and how the curriculum was going to change. So here's an example. Here's our very young John Dewey, who some of you may know began his academic career at Michigan. He's an exact example of these tendencies. So John Dewey gets his PhD at Johns Hopkins. Of course, everybody did. He comes to Michigan in 1884. He's hired to teach the capstone moral economy course that the president used to teach. It's being taught by a local minister named Crocker. He arrives and says, first of all, how could I possibly teach this course? I can teach an ethics course. I can teach you how to think about ethics, but I can't teach you how to live. And so he just says, I'm not going to teach it. And so he doesn't. And so that long-standing capstone course in moral economy off the books, because basically the philosophy people won't teach it anymore. So what does he teach? These are the courses he teaches in his first year. This is a gripper. Psychology and philosophy with special reference to the history of philosophy in Great Britain. It was packed. It was just packed. No, I'm just kidding. Kant, okay, fine. Another one, probably packed. I mean, the old guy that taught the moral economy course, that course was packed. But these really weren't packed. But what were they? They were exactly the new system. Courses taught based on his research, very specialized, elective system. Students could choose them or not. Didn't make that much difference if they did or didn't. He writes his first book here. So again, the research ethos is very alive and well here. He co-founds the graduate school in 1892 with another famous guy, Henry Carter Adams, who was the founder of the economics department and the business school, phenomenally important 19th century economist. And then he leaves for Chicago in 1894. Why? There's no undergraduate teaching at Chicago. So this guy who's fabulous, his impact on Michigan in the years that he's here is just phenomenal, but he's a case study of how this new intersection between the professionalized faculty and the elective curriculum was such a nice match. Okay, so on balance, the elective system. The curriculum is harnessed to the research interests of the faculty who were trained and specialized. This is a big change and really good, because all of a sudden now we have a motive force for changing the curriculum, which is very different from the old curriculum that couldn't change. Impressive proliferation of specialized courses. Well, we just saw that. If you wanted a course on psychology and philosophy in Great Britain, you had it. If you wanted to take a course from Dewey. If you wanted to know how to live your life, not interested. So it's a big change from the way the curriculum was taught in the old days. Not so good. It was introduced mostly because it supported faculty research interests. That's what powered the elective curriculum as long as it did. This was great for faculty who were trying to become powerful researchers because they could just teach what they did their research on, which isn't a bad idea, but that's what it was. There was no thoughtful theory or understanding of the curriculum except the theory of choice. Faculty choose what they want to teach, students choose what they want to take, and that's education. There was not a thing, oh yes, it's a good idea to have a lot of choice. Well, maybe it is, but the fact is this is very different from the kind of moral pyramid in the courses before that. And specialization ends the teaching of morality and citizenship. All of a sudden, that whole last term of the senior year just disappears. Nobody's going to teach it. Nobody thinks they can teach it. The idea that you should have a finishing term of citizenship, public morality, etc., is gone, and so all of a sudden now that's a major change. And by the way, this actually had an impact on students, ironically. There's a book written about this change at Michigan. So losing that kind of moral trajectory of the curriculum actually caused spiritual crisis among a lot of the 19th century students here, because they no longer had that idea that there was a way, kind of step by step, to be kind of acculturated into the kind of moral and political economy that would be good to be in the United States. All right, now when was this written? There are few college or university faculty in the United States that have not some complaint to make of the intellectual life of their students. The University of Michigan is no exception. The atmosphere of the campus is one of intellectual apathy rather than intellectual enthusiasm. 20 hours a week outside the classroom is a liberal average of studying. The students' interest in the external is too apparent to require exposition. Places on athletic teams, etc., are more important than scholarship, and scholarship is relegated to a subordinate position. Well, I thought about trying to trick you and say that it was written yesterday, but you would know that it wasn't written yesterday. Nobody studies 20 hours a week today, right? So that's like, wow, that was hard work in those days. Nobody does 20 hours a week now, but in any case, this was the type of attack that would be leveled against the elective system. So I mean, ironically, the problem with the elective system was it was hard to sort of justify itself. What was it actually doing, all this choice? Well, it was letting the students choose to opt out of intellectual life, was the concern that the people that were critics of it had. This is actually written, as we'll see in a moment, in 1924. And it was one of the responses to the elective system that was actually quite characteristic. There were two responses to it. One, let's call this kind of the old guard, the reimposition of the classical curriculum. So in a lot of places, the faculty that were there really wanted to go back to the old system. That wasn't going to get very far. So what they did was they began the so-called core curricula programs. So the first 2 years would be the core curricula. These are the famous ones at Columbia, Chicago, known as great books, Greek general education, etc. Essentially, this is the reimposition of the classical curriculum in the first 2 years. So In the first 2 years, it's Greek, it's Latin, maybe in translation, but you're going to be reading the classics. You're going to spend your time in the ancient world, and then you're going to kind of work your way back in the second 2 years. And the second one, which is vastly more popular, is the system that we grew up in, distribution and concentration. Most colleges and universities that give up the elective system go in this direction. And basically, this distribution comes from this idea that you're going to take 25% of your 120 credits distributed across humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, in the different divisions of your liberal arts college. Now, this is the hilarious revolutionary document at Michigan that initiates the conversation about the new structure at Michigan. This was written in 1924 by the Michigan sociologist Robert Cooley Angell, whose dissertation was on the campus, the American campus in the 20s. Very interesting book, actually. And he began this conversation in 1924 and noticed that at this point, the idea of a major and two halves of the curriculum is a big innovation. All right, so he says, a more recent innovation and one which promises added advantages is the splitting of the college course into two halves. One, the foundation of knowledge, the other, the concentration. Majors are called concentrations in these early years. So in the first 2 years, students are supervised carefully. In the second 2 years, they're more on their own responsibility, brought into intimate relations with faculty members in their chosen field. This is the beginning of the current structure of the liberal arts, and why, by the way, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of this system here at Michigan, because this document was what set it off. Now, there's going to be 6 years of rancorous discussion over this for a lot of reasons. And most importantly, by the way, not because of the curriculum so much as the fact that there were those who thought that this first 2 years should be a separate college, actually a separate college at the university. That was opposed, shocker, by every dean in the university. Because, wait a minute, are my students going to be in that college? And on and on and on. And by the way, hilariously, the group that killed it was engineering. They were not going to have their first 2 year students spending time in the first 2 years college. So this took 6 years to get through these various conversations, get rid of the idea of a building, get rid of the idea of a separate college, blah, 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 blah. And finally, in 1931, things got into place in the kind of form that we actually are familiar with. So the major framework by the 1930s then is the one that all of us probably grew up in, right? 4 years, non-professional period, liberalization first, then specialization. A wide choice of courses, mostly based on faculty research, a major or concentration and a distribution requirement, or core curriculum. But the number of places that had the core curriculum was very small. Now, you can already understand why, because basically to have a core curriculum means you have to specify what people are going to read or study, and that's a whole kettle of fish that a lot of places just didn't want to deal with, including Michigan, quite frankly. All right, but this is important to keep in mind. Where does this structure come from? It doesn't come down from heaven like the Ten Commandments. It comes from the professionalization of faculty who perceive a need to discipline student course choice and enhance intellectual activity. So the theory at the time was that concentrations or majors would actually let students be more committed to intellectual life. So the theory was this was going to actually help them get more engaged with their work. And it was also going to constrain this whole kind of elective system, which was making a lot of things difficult. And there's a lot of practical challenges for that system, which we could talk about too. So on balance, good. The curriculum in the major is dynamic. So the majors now become the specialization. And again, the curriculum is being driven by faculty research. I mean, just all the way along. Some specialization clearly benefits some students. Clearly, some students thrive in their major department. They love it. They get good at it. It's really important to them. Concentrations and majors can satisfy demands for vocational training, as they do today. Right? Why is the most popular major in LS&A economics? It has no connection with careers, right? No. And it respects the power and importance of the disciplines. Now, keep in mind, the galvanizing force in higher education now is the power of the professionalized disciplines. So if you decide you're going to have a curriculum that's going to damage the economics department, the geology department, whatever, you're out of luck. It's not going to happen. They're now very, very powerful on these research-oriented campuses like Michigan. And so this was a compromise solution which respected the power of the newly professionalized and powerful disciplines that had these national networks and all these kind of things. Now, not so good. The concentrations are seen by the faculty as analogs to graduate study. Right? So basically, the idea of a concentration, it would be kind of like graduate training, not identical, but sort of like that. And ironically, the main criterion for majors for most of the 20th century was adequate preparation for graduate study in the field. So if you got an English degree in 1955, at the faculty meeting where they talked about those requirements, they'd be debating what should be in those major requirements so that you, who had no idea of going to English graduate school, would be prepared if you went. And why was that? Because what you thought wasn't quite as important as what Joe at Harvard thought if a student from Michigan went to do graduate study at Harvard. So the conversations about the majors then, not only were they analogs to graduate study, they were designed almost exclusively as preparations for graduate study, even though a very small number of students were going to go on. Shockingly, in this professionalized faculty, nobody wants to teach the distribution courses. Why would they? Right? It's not their research. It's supposed to be general. It can't be focused. This is going backwards for a lot of people. They've just had this period of not having to worry about it. So nobody wants to teach the distribution courses. They're not supposed to be specialized. So by definition, they're not really connected with the ambition of the research-oriented faculty. And very few faculty over time know anything about the liberal arts. Right? So it's important to understand, of course, that all these things are happening in these hilariously mixed generations of faculty. So Robert Cooley Angell himself was a veteran here at Michigan of the elective curriculum. That's the curriculum he had. So that was his experience. John Dewey, on the other hand, had the classical curriculum. So you've got all these kind of interspersed kinds of generations making educational policy, but nobody's ever heard of the liberal arts. The term liberal arts is not used on this campus until after the 1930s. It's a concept that just doesn't exist when people are talking about these kind of changes. It's a concept that to some extent we've used to identify something, but it wasn't necessarily on the minds of people at the time, whose only experience before that was the classical curriculum and the elective system. All right, so again, going back to this, right, you can see the mix of these motives here in the majors that students take today. You've got some vocationalism, a lot. You've got some courses that are designed to be let me put it this way, you don't see any Greek or Latin. You don't see many of these kind of ideas that might be kind of not that. You've got a lot of interdisciplinary majors, international studies, BCN, neuroscience, communication studies, perfectly fine. But now we're in this transitional period where, ironically, for a variety of reasons, the straight disciplinary concentrations may, ironically, not be the first choice of a lot of students. That portends some kind of interesting developments in the history of the liberal arts. Now, professionalization among the faculty is an ongoing force in the 20th century. By 1989, 70% of academics feel more loyalty to their disciplines than to their institutions. This is not shocking. This is almost a predictable development of the professionalization of the faculty, but it's problematic for every institution, because basically, if your faculty aren't engaged with the institution and the institution's hopes for the curriculum and the undergraduate experience, then they're not going to do much for it. And then, of course, the students. In 2006, before the Great Recession, 92% of college-bound students felt preparing for a career was very important. 8% found the availability of a liberal arts education essential in choosing a college. So this vocationalism has been driving through the early 20th century. It's not just a product of the recession, although God knows the recession accelerated it extraordinarily. If you look at that list of majors in LS&A, it's got basically career preparation written all over it, of course, right? And maybe that's fine, but it certainly is that. All right, now here's another important truth about the liberal arts. It's the place, liberal arts courses turn out to be the place where there's the most learning gain. So one of the interesting studies that came out in recent years, which has been read as a muckraking of higher education, is called Academically Adrift: Limited Learning on College Campuses. Very famous, perceived as an attack on higher education. Some of it is. They reveal the shocking truth that at the highest performing campuses, the average amount of homework per week is 9 hours. That was thought to be a shock to people that were reviewing this book. But they did find something buried in the study, that it was students in the liberal arts and sciences that exhibit the most learning gains because of the high expectations set by faculty in these fields, the higher average assignments in both reading and writing, and the need for solitary study for such assignments. So something important is happening in this curricular structure that's measurable. That is, that there's more learning gain in colleges organized this way than in some others. It's not exactly clear why that is, but it certainly is worth pointing out. Another truth about the liberal arts, maybe, certainly higher education. What is the role of higher education vis-a-vis society? At the end of the road, this is Louis Menand's book, The Marketplace of Ideas. This is a writer who's on the faculty at Harvard that writes for the New Yorker all the time. This is a fabulously accessible book on all these issues. At the end of the road, there's a danger, which is the culture of the university will become just an echo of the public culture. This is actually true. That is, I think it's true. I think probably most of us would agree with that. The university's culture has to be the culture that asks questions of the society and brings up topics toward the society which it doesn't want to face itself. That's a very, very important function. Who's going to do it? Who's going to do it if the universities don't do it? But also, how do we make sure that that's what's happening on college campuses? And that's really kind of a complicated thing, but it's an important thing. We think that this is one of the roles of a liberal arts college, and it may be, but the connection between this function and the specifics of the liberal arts structure is not exactly crystal clear. So what does the future hold? This is the point where the historian feels just great. Not my job to talk about the future. So the future is not my job. History is hell until we get to the future, and then it's just the best job in town because I'm not responsible for it. I will make a few carefully guarded statements about the future and then stop. So from the past, it's important that we always reflect on the fact that the current structure is the product of a particular moment in history, not any universally true ideal structure for undergraduate education or for organizing a university or anything else. It carries, like every other structure, legacies and suppresses choices that might be alternatives. So this structure has suppressed, whatever the value might have been, I'm not saying it was a lot, of the classical curriculum, for example. It has eliminated thoughts of the elective curriculum, which in some ways it would be interesting to know if that wasn't, to some extent, kind of one of the most exciting curriculums in American history. So this structure that we are oftentimes kind of called upon to defend needs to be recognized as simply a product of history, and not even our history, a history of 100 years ago. This was the product of the newly professionalized faculty thinking about how universities should be organized in the 1920s and 30s. And then sadly, even despite what Aram and his co-author might say about finding more learning gain in liberal arts, there's no research that it actually works. So a great research project would be, what is the personal experience of a student in LS&A, and how does that compare with the personal experience of a student in engineering? You'll be shocked to discover that's never been done. It's one of those questions that cries out to be answered, but for all kinds of reasons, it's not clear that anybody in particular wants to answer it. All right, so the past is basically saying what the past always says. I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that something happened in history, and don't think that that's sacred. It's just what happened to happen at a certain point in time, and you should always keep that in mind. Some thoughts for the future from the present. Okay, so as Gary was so rude to point out, I've been around for a long time. This moment in history of higher education is the worst, the absolute worst in my life. There has never been such a cynical, coruscating conversation about higher education in general and the liberal arts in particular in all the years that I've been a student, a teacher, a graduate student, what have you. And so I just want to say we are living in a very, very dangerous moment for higher education and for the liberal arts. Now, why? And I want to say this is really important. It's because of the increasing cost of higher education, in my opinion. So it's driving and in a sense confirming two sides of a conversation that otherwise have been separated up until now. And one side is economic payoff. So if you believe in vocationalism as an outcome of higher education, it gets worse and worse and worse every time tuition goes up. So the more expensive a liberal arts degree is, the more you demand a vocational payoff, or for that matter, any other kind of degree. But the demand is highest for the liberal arts, which doesn't have a specific vocational outcome. So higher ed cost drives the conversation about economic payoff. Meanwhile, the group that used to have no leverage at all, who are constantly carping about the politicization of the curriculum, now have new leverage because they're saying, you're paying all this money and all you get is political correctness. That's a powerful two-edged sword driven by increasing costs that's now got much more leverage than before. So one of my fun things being Dean of LS&A was being visited by a member of the State House of Representatives, a notorious conservative, who brought me a list of 80 courses that were a waste of the taxpayers' money and wanted to know what we were going to do about these 80 courses. Now that would have been in the early 2000s. So we had to go through a big blah blah, act like we were paying attention for 5 minutes. And then, of course, my job was to notify the instructors of these 80 courses that this guy was going to put this on the web, that their courses were a waste of taxpayer money. So I had to send out, I don't know, 75 or 80 messages. And, of course, the return I got was, right on! And then other people who weren't on the list were mad. You know, wait a minute, how come my class wasn't on the list? And it went nowhere. It went nowhere. It had no effect. Now, there were two reasons for that, of course. In Michigan, constitutional autonomy is so powerful that if a state legislature, wants to come down and condemn the whole curriculum, there's not a thing they can do about it. But more importantly, in those days, conflicts over the curriculum just didn't get leverage because we were still cheap, because the cost was still low. Once the cost went up, you had this horrible joining of the critics of the curriculum and the critics of the lack of vocationalism. That's a whole new phenomenon, quite frankly. And it's not getting any better. And the universities themselves carry the blame for it. They killed themselves by consistently increasing price after the Great Recession. That was a disastrous policy with hindsight. Okay, so we're in a terrible moment. It's very dangerous. Now, the critics are wrong about just about everything they say. For one thing, anyone who says that the goal of universities today is political indoctrination, they've never even looked at the structure of the curriculum. No one is required to take anything. But in fact, in a course of 5 days, you go from different cultures all day long. So you have your econ course at 8, you have a psychology course at 10, you have a history course at 3. Each one of those is going to have a different framework and certainly a different kinds of implications for politics. Nobody gets an econ major who's a bleeding heart. I mean, in other words, you're not getting a lot of political correctness in the econ department, and thousands of students are majoring that every year. So the truth is, the design of higher education, to some extent, prevents the overwhelming politicization of this. So the critics are wrong about a lot. We could talk about that. But the defenders are also off balance, right? It is time to listen a little bit, not necessarily to the screwballs who are on all sides of this debate, but to ask ourselves, is it time after 100 years? Now, in academic time is slow, but 100 years is still a long time. So we've been basically kind of doing the same thing for 100 years, and we've been kind of convincing ourselves that the outcome we want is happening because of that same thing that we've been doing for 100 years. And the truth is, there's probably nothing that does the same thing over the course of 100 years, and certainly not you wouldn't think, a curriculum for higher education. It persists for reasons, in other words, that may or may not be connected to what we think we're trying to do with that structure. So the critics are wrong because they're asking the wrong question. But the question that universities have to ask is, why did we decide this to begin with? And is it the thing we want to stick with once we know where it came from, which may not have been the kind of thing we thought was happening? So again, I conclude with this, that if we look at the whole history of higher education curriculum and the liberal arts in particular, and we say, what is important? It's this, right? It's this thing we looked at before. It's the experience, it's the transformation, it's the production of a person of a certain kind, not the maintenance of a particular curricular structure, because there have been a bunch of those over the course of time. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to have any questions or comments you have.
I noticed that you haven't mentioned anything about the degree program
Yeah,
in the college.
sure, I could. Yeah,
Was supposed to be, at least in theory, something that
yeah.
brought
Yeah.
everything together. It had a lot of controversy to it.
Oh, yeah. So those of you this is the BGS degree. It's an interesting story. In fact, there could be a really interesting analysis of that, and I won't go into it, but it's really interesting because what it is the students wanted to abolish the language requirement. And there was a furious faculty meeting, and it's really interesting to think about what used to get people crazed. And it may be sad that it doesn't now, but okay, fine. So the students showed up. They wanted to abolish the language requirement. There were enough people kind of sympathetic to it in the faculty meeting. This was 1969 maybe or something. They looked like it actually might pass. So they decided to take it, put it into a committee, try to work out the differences. They decided, okay, they came back with another degree called the Bachelor of General Studies. No major. You had to put together a program of study, but not a major. No language requirement, key, but no major. All right, so that was the trade-off. You don't have to take a language in the BGS, but you won't have a certification in a field. That was the compromise. It still exists. Maybe 125 students a year do it. Ironically, it doesn't work well with vocationalism because that certification of the major turns out to be powerful. So it turned out to be a compromise that rapidly became less than necessary, but it could be the kind of thing that if you wanted to go back toward the elective curriculum, the degree for that already exists, the Bachelor of General Studies. It would have to have this kind of bad odor around it as the sort of subsidiary, second-class degree because of no language requirement, but it could actually be a place to start thinking about how to open up alternatives to the current system. Yes?
So in thinking about the cost complication that you mentioned at the end and how that's driving discussion in the history of students who entered under the classical curriculum, maybe, I'm thinking about the age at which students enter college, and if your research has uncovered anything about like the age at which maybe students were going to university in the 19th century, and maybe people now are talking about gap years or taking a community college sort of program first before you evolve into.
Right, yeah, yeah.
I'm curious what.
Well, the classical curriculum was populated by a surprising range of ages. There were some very, very young. Keep in mind, you had to have Greek and Latin, so your life chances dictated your ability to come to the university with those requirements. So if you had a father who was a minister who sat you down every day and taught you Greek and Latin, you could come to the college when you were 15. If, on the other hand, you went to a place where there wasn't a high school or there wasn't a prep school, then you had to pay somebody to tutor you in Greek and Latin, and you might be 20 before you showed up. If you had the money to come to college, and by the way, the biggest money was your room and board. It wasn't the tuition, which was negligible. You might teach in a country school one semester, so you would alternate studying and teaching, and so you might be 25 when you got your degree. Now, as the century goes on, more and more students are high school graduates and are arriving in that thing. So basically, for about 100 and maybe 120 years, it's been the slice has been the 18 to 22-year-old slice at Michigan. Michigan has not been friendly to a wide range of age students. It hasn't had the facilities for it. It hasn't had the classes are scheduled in a day that means you basically can't work to come here. So it's been focused on a group that's about 18 to 22 for about 120 years.
So when did the term liberal arts appear? Why? What did whoever invented it think it was doing for them at the time?
Well, the important thing about this is this curriculum emerged before the term liberal arts emerged. Okay, so ironically, the name of this actually comes on this campus I'm talking about now. I can give you the year. I mean, so this could be another interesting digression. Things we get ourselves into. The term liberal arts came from the World's Fair of 1893. And in the World's Fair of 1893, the famous White City in Chicago, there was a building called the Liberal Arts Building. That was the first time that there was kind of, what in the hell is that? Now, if you look at what was in that building, it was everything under the sun. It wasn't academic. It was all kinds of things. But every university in America was invited to put a display, all the big universities were invited to put a display in the Liberal Arts Building. And Michigan had one. Really interesting. We have a lot of the stuff from it in the Bentley, the documentation of it. So that's kind of when the term got out there, that it was something about higher education and something about things and blah, 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 blah. So if you look around, that's kind of when you're first seeing it. That term then becomes appropriated after it becomes really most popular in 1945 when the famous Harvard Red Book is published. This is the famous guide to the Harvard curriculum after the war. But in the 30s, it's pretty unstable. I mean, it's not really a very specific term that refers to anything in particular. So it takes a while to get attached to this.
Actually, what you're telling us is it still actually doesn't refer to anything in particular.
Well, this is it. I mean, like I said, it identifies a structure, not a curriculum. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you talk about where Robert Angel and the honors program fits into this discussion?
Yeah. So Angel, who is Robert Cooley Angel, who by the way is President Angel's son, so he's part of the. And whose middle name is the name of Mortimer Cooley, who was the dean of engineering. This guy was totally plugged into University of Michigan culture. He, by the way, who thought sports was terrible, was a star of the tennis team when he was an undergraduate student in Michigan. But anyway, so he gets on the faculty in the sociology department. He writes this really interesting book on the college. Fascinating. By the way, in there he actually he asks people the income of their families, where they came from, and all that. So there's a chapter on. And by the way, it's all about Michigan. It's camouflaged in the book, but it's all about Michigan, if you ever want to read an interesting book about Michigan in the 20s. All right, so he is then perceived to be this kind of educational reformer, and in this document, he calls for honors courses. So he says, here's the structure, and an added benefit would be to offer honors courses in a variety of fields. So he first proposed the idea of honors courses that would go along with the concentrations. And I want to say that he is sort of thought to be, I think it's correct, the founder of the honors program here. I want to say it's in the 40s, and he's actually connected with it after the war. So I think that's my hazy record. But he's a major player on the campus, a big educational reformer, a tremendously strong advocate for students. Plays a really positive role in all these things, as opposed to his brother, who goes off to be the president of Yale and turns out to be a horror story for a lot of reasons. Yes, great.
How did the residential college fit into that transition?
Well, don't forget, the residential college comes up in 1961. Does somebody remember? 61?
Let me go back to Little's proposals for something like the residential college.
Yeah, so this is, and don't forget, another interesting thing about Michigan that's very unique is there's no dorms here, right? So President Tappan throws the students off the campus in 1857. And so from 1857 to 1915, there's no dorms. And after 1915, there are 3 women's dorms and no men's dorms. The first men's dorm is West Quad in 1938-39. So the idea of there's no residence, so there's no concept of a residential education in concrete terms. Now, there are thoughts about it. And so when the dorms start to become planned and become bigger, and of course in the 30s, there's the New Deal programs fund the building of the big dorms that we still have today. The quads, all the halls on the hill, these were all built by PWA, CWA, New Deal money. There was a big bonanza for Michigan. All right, so when those buildings start being planned, then there has to be some kind of a curricular component. And the idea is, yes, we're going to have this kind of residential education program. And there's a lot of planning that goes along with it, and there's a house master, and it's divided up into smaller houses, and there's going to be a master of each house, and all these kind of things. The war comes, disrupts all this planning. People come back from the war. Shocker, no faculty want to live in the dorms or even be in the program. So basically what happened was that concept collapsed. So the residential college is a response to that collapse. So the idea of a residential college, now they didn't ask faculty to live there, but the idea of students living and studying in the same building really is something that comes up after that. It's connected to the 60s, of course, and a lot of that. But basically it was what the dorm system had failed to do, and that's why it had the kind of cachet that it did at the time. But the idea there originally was much more radical than what it developed into. So the idea of the RC was really to kind of be a place that generated new kinds of curriculum and new opportunities of all kinds, and that's probably not been quite that kind of a place as time has gone on. Yes?
It's my understanding that students in like the College of Engineering take a lot of, or are required to take a lot of liberal electives and all?
No. One a term.
Oh, anyway, could you say if there's been any coordination between these other colleges and LS&A and all Or is it just a happenstance that people like this course, I'm going to sign up?
Yeah. So the engineering curriculum has become so structured over time, by the way, that most engineers can't even graduate in 4 years. They've got to take so much engineering. So if you go to the December commencement, it's full of engineers. They have to go 4.5 years to get their degrees, just to finish their courses. They get to take one course outside of engineering a term. So very small. So no, there's no coordination because, you know, first of all, it's just not a big enough demand. And secondly, the question of what they might want to take, they're under a lot of pressure. They call, as you probably know, the students have these terms for each other. So the engineers call LS&A LS and play, and they kind of like the idea that they're going to try to find an easy course over there. Meanwhile, the LS&A students call the Ross students Ross holes. Terrible. So there's a little bit of funny kind of competition. What's the the problem now? Not a problem, but the reality of it now is mapped onto all this now, of course, is the budget system that rewards the enrollment of students in your college. Therefore, there's now not only not collaboration, there's a lot of competition. And now all the professional schools have dropped down undergraduate programs. So now we have an undergraduate program in public policy, public health, School of Information. All these places that were exclusively graduate are now have an undergraduate program. Shocker, don't see I said this, because there's money in it, and there wasn't, say, 25 years ago. So now another question for LS&A is, when you're surrounded by these very clearly vocational degree programs, what happens to you? And that's a serious thing that the university is going to have to think about going forward. LS&A is geared up to be big. It's budgeted to be big. Its departments are big. It's expecting a lot of students. But if more and more of them are being sucked into these other undergraduate programs around the campus, which didn't exist 20 years ago, then mapped onto all this conversation is a real question about fiscal policy and how to fund different kinds of things. And within LS&A, all liberal arts colleges, by the way, here's another very, very serious fiscal situation. So historically, there's been a tremendous transfer of resources in liberal arts colleges between the less expensive disciplines to teach and the more expensive disciplines to teach. So it has not been wrong for a department like, say, English to say, we're helping support physics, because it's very cheap to teach students in English, and it's very expensive to teach students in physics. The decline of the enrollment in the humanities portends another crisis for liberal arts colleges everywhere, by the way, precisely because, yeah, there was a truth to that. There was an exchange of resources across these different disciplines, and now that's kind of dropping off a bit with the decline in the enrollment in the cheaper side of the house, and that's going to have implications, I think, going forward, too. Yes?
Elimination of subjects, like at Michigan, in other schools, they dropped journalism and they dropped geography.
Yeah, now keep in mind, at Michigan, there's nothing like that at present going on. It's important to say that the geography was dropped in 1982, and journalism in 1990-something, 1995 maybe. That's really not a current plan. I don't think anybody's thinking about that, at least as far as I know. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. Many places are, but I will tell you that the higher the prestige of the university, the less there's program discontinuance. So all of this stuff, by the way, there's a whole other side of all this, which is the competitive relationship with other institutions. So one of the reasons why Michigan is following Harvard is because they're trying to recruit the same faculty. And so you can't, if you want to recruit John Dewey, you have to let him teach what he wants, otherwise he'll just go someplace else. And that gets to become more and more intense as the time goes on after the 1890s, for example. So no, I don't think there's any, I've not heard of any recent discontinuance. There's redefinitions, moving around, stuff like that, but discontinuance, for one thing, is an extremely cumbersome process, too. And I think the lesson of the 80s was, you know, you don't benefit that much from closing out a program.
But the status goes with the departments that bring in the most money.
No, not necessarily. I mean, the highest ranked departments in this college are the social science departments, and they don't all bring in that much money. So it's not always the case that the status goes with the money. Yes, John? Dan.
You walk around the campus and you see new construction, you see more students, enrollment
Yep.
continues to go up. It all seems to be a happy future. But my experience even at the business school,
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, so some striking developments at the professional level, I think that probably none of us thought we'd live to see the day when law schools were struggling to fill their first year class. And again, this is completely driven by cost. Right? So I taught a class of 27 seniors 2 years ago. Not a single one was thinking about going to law school. I mean, that would have been unheard of 20 years ago. And why weren't they thinking about it? They couldn't earn enough money to pay off the cost of going to law school. Same thing with the MBA. So the problem is this cost problem is driving up, is causing problems across the board. And so one of the things that's ironically happening. So let's imagine we wanted to go back to the elective system and let students take courses wherever they wanted. So if you wanted to take an MBA course, welcome. Want to take a law course? Fine. Wow, perfect time for it. A lot of other people don't want to take those courses nowadays. They don't want to pay for them, but an undergraduate could be admitted to take classes anywhere they wanted. So yeah, there is a real surprise going on right now, which is that some of these professional degrees are so expensive that they're pricing themselves out of the market, and these places are ranked so strenuously that they have a hard time going down the pool of applicants because of their average GPAs and scores drop, then they suffer in the rankings, and that's a real problem for the high prestige professional schools. So that's a big challenge. The solution to that, ironically, may be opening the doors to more the financial solution, but and also maybe kind of interesting intellectual solution. So one thing that's interesting is the division between the case method and not. So many of the professional schools have a method that's actually quite interesting called the case method. Certainly law and business do. That's not used very much in LS&A at all. It might be a really interesting thing for undergraduates to have a lot of courses in the case method, and maybe this will be an opportunity. All of these changes are scary at the moment, but of course they could result in different kinds of solutions going forward. And so it could be that this crisis, the question is at this crisis, and I want to emphasize again, it is a really serious time for higher education. But one way to think about this is it's also a good chance to really kind of think right to the bottom of things. What are we actually doing? What do we want to see happen? What can we do that's going to be the best possible outcome for students and allow us to survive economically? That's kind of what we have to think about, and it's a big challenge. But the defensive position, which, sad to say, higher education has taken since the recession, we'll just continue to do what we do, and it's going to be really expensive, and congratulations, you can come here and pay for it. Wow, that's the thing that probably is going to be hard to persist in. But a radical rethinking then also requires us to think about changing things, and that's also always a struggle. But the point is that some of this thought has been done over time. We can now see, okay, this is what people thought about this curriculum, about that curriculum. It's not that we don't have resources, probably even from the past, maybe even from the future. So anyway, the thing is that the worst thing we can do is hunker down at this moment and say, no, it's too scary to think about the future because we've got so many enemies. That's the time, oftentimes, when you want to think about the possibilities and not necessarily cave to the enemies, but just kind of rethink what you're doing and see if there's a path that might be more interesting. And that's where history gets kind of important, I think. Yeah, Jeff.
So is it happening anywhere, like in the big foundations, for instance?
You know, interestingly enough, Paul knows a little bit about this. I mean, I don't know if anybody's supporting that. They're supporting research about things. But as to funding a large-scale curricular experiment, I don't know of it. So
Because most of, I've been looking for the sort of the places in what you've been saying where there might be some optimistic projection of innovative thought that might actually carry us forward in the ways that you were gesturing at various points. And there didn't seem to be very much, except towards the end of some of the last things you were saying. You seemed to be saying that because of the compulsions of cost and the improvising of solutions, say in the professional schools, that it might loosen things up so that there may be some unintended consequences that create some spaces where things can happen. I mean, that's not very hopeful.
No. I would say that it's one of these it's one of these things where I would say it's one of those moments where the incentive to change is coming from the difficulty of the situation, and the path forward is by no means clear. But now here's another thing that's happening, and I won't go on much longer, but so across the board, the employment market for PhDs And I mean across the board. It's just as bad in the sciences as it is in the humanities and social science. The employment market for PhDs has basically collapsed. So most disciplines have no idea where their graduate students will be placed after they get a PhD. And there's now been an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences encouraging PhDs in the sciences to be satisfied with being researchers, research technicians, rather than principal investigators in the sciences. This is a radical change in graduate education. And therefore, ironically, what's going to happen, and what is happening, is a contraction in the size of graduate programs connected to, again, to these market changes in demand in some disciplines, many of the disciplines, which means there'll be less and less graduate teaching going forward. So in a funny way, believe it or not, again, if you want to kind of make the best of a bad situation, that contraction also opens up some space. So now, if you want to say, what kind of teaching am I going to be doing over the next 20 years, believe it or not, it'll be very rarely graduate teaching. So if you really want to think about how to enrich your teaching, enrich your feelings about teaching, you've got to really start to dig down and start thinking about improving undergraduate teaching, because that's the way most people are going to spend most of their time going forward. That's a certainty, given the shape of the job market. So that's got some potential for change too. Yes?
So you said a little bit at the beginning that other countries do things differently. Have we looked at what other countries?
Well, see, what they do is they track you, right? So you take a national exam when you're 16 and bang, that's where you are. That's England, that's France, that's China, that's just about everywhere. So that's never going to go here. And I don't think anybody wants that. Certainly parents don't want it. So the idea of having this period where you get to do what you choose is so American, of course, obviously, right? It's a market kind of a model. But the thing is, the European system is so different that basically by the age of 16, you're pretty much done with your career planning. And people often point out, well, how come college degrees only take 3 years in the continent in England? Well, it's because there's no electives. Boom. You arrive to be this, and you stay there for 3 years, and then you're done. So, I mean, ironically, that system has never been in the United States, and I don't see it could ever come in. So that's probably not going to be an option unless something even more dire happens than I can imagine. All right. Thank you very much. It's been fun.